What if the future of the global economy is being decided right now, behind closed doors? A battle is brewing between the two largest economies in the world, and it's not just about trade, it's about power, influence, and control over the technologies that will shape tomorrow. What's really at stake in the US-China trade war? Could this conflict be the spark that changes everything? Stay tuned, because the truth behind this battle is far more complicated than you think. The trade war between the US and China didn't emerge overnight, it's the result of years of tension, economic strategies, and global ambitions. In 2018, President Donald Trump took a decisive step that shocked the world. He imposed steep tariffs on Chinese goods, citing a massive trade imbalance. The US was importing far more from China than it was exporting, and Trump's administration claimed that the US was being taken advantage of in trade agreements. But this wasn't just about reducing the deficit. The US government argued that China's unfair trade practices, such as intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and heavy state subsidies for Chinese companies, were distorting global markets. It was also about rebalancing the global economic order, a challenge that China was increasingly seen as a threat to, especially as it sought to dominate emerging technologies like 5G, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. The US imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, ranging from electronics to steel. China retaliated swiftly, hitting US exports like soybeans, automobiles, and aircraft. But these were just the first moves in what would become a much more complex and high-stakes battle. The US government believed that the tariffs would push China to the negotiating table and force them to agree to reforms. But China, too, had its own strategies in place. Rather than simply backing down, China took a different approach. It used its massive consumer market as leverage, striking back with tariffs of its own. But the real battle would soon shift from traditional industries to the realm of high technology. China's long-term economic strategy has always involved moving away from cheap manufacturing to becoming a leader in cutting-edge fields like AI, 5G, and robotics. And it was this ambition that became a key flashpoint in the trade war. By 2019, the trade war escalated. The US accused China of stealing intellectual property and forced technology transfers, where foreign companies were required to hand over their tech secrets in exchange for access to China's market. These practices were seen as giving Chinese firms an unfair advantage in global competition. The US response. The Trump administration blacklisted key Chinese companies, including the telecom giant Huawei, blocking them from accessing essential US technology, like semiconductor chips and software. This hit Huawei hard, but it was just the beginning. The trade war was now entangled with issues of cybersecurity, national security, and geopolitics, issues that would extend far beyond just tariffs on goods. China, in turn, retaliated not just through tariffs but also by using the economic leverage of its state-controlled enterprises to dominate certain sectors. One of the key strategies was to build its technological self-sufficiency, an ambition that led China to invest heavily in its own semiconductor industry, 5G networks, and electric vehicles. These efforts were designed to reduce China's dependency on foreign technology and to ensure that, in the long run, China would be the one dictating the rules of the technological landscape. Yet, despite the heightened tensions, there were attempts at negotiations. Trade talks were held, with promises of a Phase 1 deal that would ease some tariffs. But even as deals were being discussed, new rounds of tariffs were implemented, and the Chinese economy continued to show signs of strain. What became increasingly clear was that the conflict was no longer just about trade deficits or tariffs, it was about a broader battle for global dominance in key industries. The US-China trade war began to resemble a high-stakes chess game, where each side tried to outmaneuver the other, using everything from tariffs and technology to geopolitical alliances and diplomatic pressure. It was no longer just about economic policies, it was about establishing long-term control over the global economy, where the future of industries like technology, energy, and even manufacturing would be shaped for generations to come. So, what's at stake in this trade war? The future of global supply chains, the development of technologies that will define the 21st century, and the balance of power in a rapidly changing world. But perhaps, most importantly, the outcome of this battle could determine who controls the global economic order in the years to come. Will the U.S. succeed in maintaining its economic dominance, or will China emerge as the new global leader? As the trade war between the U.S. and China escalated, the effects were felt on the ground, especially by Chinese businesses, both large and small. What began as a series of economic measures soon transformed into a broader challenge for the very structure of China's economy. Let's take a closer look at how these escalating tariffs and sanctions have impacted Chinese companies, especially those who were once seen as rising stars on the global stage. Large Chinese companies were the first to feel the pain. Take Huawei, the crown jewel of China's tech sector. As one of the world's leading telecommunications companies, Huawei's business was shattered by the U.S. government's decision to blacklist it, blocking the company from accessing crucial American technologies like semiconductors, software, and network equipment. This wasn't just a blow to Huawei, it was a blow to China's entire tech industry. Huawei had been at the forefront of developing 5G technology, and suddenly, it was cut off from the global tech ecosystem. The U.S. had effectively shut down Huawei's ability to innovate, at least in the short term. But Huawei was not alone. Chinese manufacturers, especially those in the electronics and automobile sectors, found themselves struggling with new barriers. The tariffs imposed by the U.S. meant that Chinese products faced significantly higher costs when trying to enter the American market. Many businesses, even those producing everyday items like shoes, clothing, and electronics, found themselves unable to compete with the rising prices that came with the tariffs. This led to a gradual, but significant, shrinkage of Chinese market share in the U.S. and forced companies to look for alternative markets or to scale back operations altogether. Small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, in China, which make up the backbone of the economy, were perhaps the hardest hit. These companies, which rely heavily on exports to the U.S. and other Western countries, suddenly found themselves facing a severe drop in demand for their products. The strain of higher costs, combined with a reduction in orders, left many businesses in a fight for survival. For many of these SMEs, it was a matter of either adapting or closing down altogether. In many regions of China, there were reports of small factories and family-run businesses closing their doors for good. These closures were not just a loss for the companies themselves, but a blow to the local communities that depended on them for jobs. The situation became even more dire for companies in industries heavily reliant on American technology, such as those involved in the production of smartphones, laptops, and semiconductors. In response to the sanctions, China attempted to ramp up its own technological development, pouring billions of dollars into homegrown industries to counter the growing dependency on American companies. However, this shift towards self-sufficiency is a slow and challenging process. Chinese companies could not immediately replace the critical technologies they lost access to. This left many scrambling for alternative suppliers or trying to quickly develop their own technology, often with mixed results. One of the most notable examples of this struggle to adapt came from Temu, a rising e-commerce giant in China that had begun to make significant inroads into the U.S. market. Temu, like many other Chinese firms, relied heavily on digital advertising and U.S. consumer demand to fuel its growth. But as the trade war raged on, Temu found itself facing mounting pressure. In a dramatic move, the company suspended all advertising in the U.S., signaling a severe downturn in its operations. Temu's decision was emblematic of the broader struggle faced by Chinese companies who had long relied on U.S. consumers and markets to support their growth. Now, with the threat of tariffs and sanctions looming over them, they were forced to scale back operations and rethink their strategies. However, the repercussions of the trade war go beyond just the immediate losses. For Chinese businesses, this trade conflict has led to a shift in the way they approach their global strategy. Many Chinese companies are now reconsidering their dependence on the U.S. market and beginning to pivot towards new, emerging markets. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe are becoming more attractive alternatives as Chinese businesses look for new revenue streams. China has also been investing heavily in its Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious plan to build infrastructure and foster trade relationships across Asia, Africa, and Europe. This initiative has allowed Chinese companies to expand their reach into new markets that may not have been previously accessible. While this shift won't happen overnight, the Belt and Road Initiative represents a long-term strategy that could help China regain some of the ground lost in its battle with the U.S. by diversifying its export markets. Despite these efforts, the road ahead for Chinese businesses remains uncertain. The world is watching closely as the trade war continues to unfold. While many Chinese companies are trying to adapt and find new opportunities, they are doing so under the shadow of continued geopolitical tensions, global economic instability, and a rapidly changing technological landscape. In the end, the question remains, can Chinese companies overcome the challenges posed by the trade war? Will they successfully pivot to new markets and diversify their operations, or will they continue to struggle under the weight of tariffs, sanctions, and technological decoupling from the West? The answer to that question will shape the future of China's economy, and the global economy as a whole. As the U.S.-China trade war intensified, its effects rippled far beyond just the economic sphere. The conflict began to have a profound impact on China's political landscape and the way the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, controlled public opinion, both at home and abroad. This wasn't just about tariffs or trade, it became a matter of national pride, political control, and global influence. The CCP's response to the trade war wasn't just to double down on its economic policies. The party began to actively manipulate the narrative, using state-run media to shape public opinion. The goal was clear: to foster a sense of unity and patriotism while positioning China as a victim of unfair American policies. The U.S. was portrayed as an aggressor, seeking to undermine China's rise as a global power. The message to the Chinese people was one of resilience and strength in the face of foreign hostility. One of the most significant tactics the CCP used was to invoke anti-American sentiment. In the midst of the trade war, the Chinese government actively encouraged citizens to boycott U.S. products, and in some cases, entire sectors of American businesses were targeted. The government framed this as a patriotic duty, a way for the Chinese people to show solidarity with their government in resisting U.S. interference. Chinese social media was flooded with campaigns condemning American policies and celebrating China's strength. However, this narrative wasn't just confined to China's borders. The CCP understood that the war for global influence was not only about economic power, it was also about controlling perceptions. In this new era of media warfare, China's control over its own information became a key weapon. The government cracked down on any dissenting voices, censoring criticism of its actions and punishing those who dared to question the party's official narrative. The censorship extended far beyond domestic borders. The CCP sought to exert influence over foreign media, particularly Hollywood. In an unprecedented move, the Chinese government began to crack down on films and media content that it deemed unfavorable to its image or that touched on sensitive topics, such as the Tiananmen Square protests or Taiwan. Hollywood, ever dependent on the Chinese market, found itself walking a fine line. Filmmakers began to self-censor, making changes to their movies in order to avoid angering the Chinese government and losing access to one of the world's largest movie markets. For example, films like Bohemian Rhapsody, which discussed Freddie Mercury's sexuality, were altered to remove references to LGBTQ+ content when shown in China. In other cases, films that portrayed sensitive historical events were banned outright, such as any references to the Tiananmen Square massacre. This wasn't just about a desire to maintain a controlled narrative, it was about China asserting its power in the global entertainment industry. By controlling the content that could be shown, China was able to maintain a strict grip on how it was portrayed to the world. Another key component of the CCP's political strategy was to create a strong, China-first narrative, positioning the country as a beacon of national pride and a champion of global governance. In response to the U.S. sanctions, China's leadership began to emphasize its role as a global leader, not just economically but politically and culturally as well. President Xi Jinping's vision of a new China became central to the country's messaging, and the CCP worked tirelessly to portray China as not only rising but as an essential global player that would reshape the future. Through this rhetoric, the CCP aimed to bolster support domestically, rallying the population behind a common cause. By portraying the U.S. as an imperialist power trying to stifle China's rise, the CCP sought to consolidate its political control and maintain its legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people. The narrative was clear: China was not just a victim of the U.S.'s aggression, but a proud nation standing up for its rightful place on the world stage. But this control over the media and political narrative came at a cost. As the trade war raged on, China's internal politics became more repressive. The CCP ramped up efforts to silence critics, including prominent business figures, academics, and even artists. Social media became heavily monitored, and any form of dissent against the party's narrative was quickly silenced. Those who questioned the government's handling of the trade war or its economic policies found themselves facing significant consequences, ranging from online censorship to imprisonment. The CCP's ability to control the narrative within China was bolstered by its growing influence on the global stage. Through its extensive media outreach, including investments in international news outlets and cultural exchanges, China began to reshape how it was perceived abroad. The CCP realized that its domestic media efforts were just one part of the equation. To truly solidify its global position, it needed to ensure that international audiences also saw China in the way it intended. At the heart of this media campaign was the idea that China's rise could not, and should not, be stopped. The U.S., in this narrative, was the villain, trying to block China's progress and undermine its ambitions. The trade war was presented as just one battle in a much larger geopolitical struggle, one that China was determined to win. The question now is, will this narrative of strength and resilience succeed in solidifying China's position as a global superpower, or will it deepen the divide between East and West, leading to even greater tensions in the years to come? As the trade war between the U.S. and China deepened, the battle over technology quickly emerged as one of the most critical fronts in this conflict. It wasn't just about the exchange of tariffs or the flow of goods, it was about who would control the technologies that would define the future of global power. And in this high-stakes race, both countries understood that the winner would have a significant edge in shaping the 21st century economy. One of the most notable battlegrounds in this war for technological supremacy is 5G, the next-generation wireless technology that promises to revolutionize industries ranging from telecommunications to autonomous vehicles. 5G is not just about faster internet speeds, it's about creating the infrastructure for the next wave of technological innovation. And China, with its tech giants like Huawei, was positioning itself to dominate this field. Huawei, China's largest telecom company, was emerging as a global leader in 5G technology, outpacing many American competitors. With its cutting-edge equipment, Huawei became the go-to supplier for 5G networks in dozens of countries, from Europe to Asia. But this didn't sit well with the U.S. government, which viewed Huawei not only as a business competitor but as a potential security threat. The U.S. raised concerns that Huawei's close ties to the Chinese government could allow China to use Huawei's 5G infrastructure for espionage purposes, effectively making it a Trojan horse for Chinese surveillance. To combat Huawei's growing influence, the U.S. implemented a series of aggressive measures, including placing the company on the Entity List, which restricted Huawei's access to critical American technologies. American companies like Google, Intel, and Qualcomm were forbidden from supplying Huawei with key software and hardware, including Google's Android operating system, which powers Huawei's smartphones. The U.S. also pressured its allies to avoid using Huawei's 5G equipment, warning them of the potential risks to their national security and intelligence sharing agreements. However, China didn't back down. In response, Beijing intensified its push to become self-sufficient in technology. Chinese companies began to develop alternatives to American-made chips, operating systems, and software. One of the most significant moves was the creation of the Chinese-owned operating system Harmony OS, which was intended to replace Android on Huawei's smartphones. But developing a competitor to Android was no easy task. Huawei's Harmony OS faced steep challenges in gaining traction, as it lacked the app ecosystem and developer support that Android and iOS had built over the years. In addition to 5G, China was also pouring significant resources into another emerging technology, artificial intelligence, AI. AI has become a cornerstone of China's future economic strategy, with the government investing billions of dollars into AI research, development, and infrastructure. China aims to become the global leader in AI by 2030, and it sees this technology as key to its economic growth, military strength, and global influence. The Chinese government's ambitious plans are backed by the country's vast pool of data, thanks to its large population and lack of strict data privacy laws. China's progress in AI has already started to challenge the dominance of American tech giants like Google and Microsoft. For example, China's Baidu has developed cutting-edge AI technologies for autonomous vehicles, and Chinese companies like SenseTime and Megvii are at the forefront of facial recognition technology. The U.S. government, wary of the potential national security implications, has raised alarms about the rapid development of Chinese AI and its potential for surveillance. The battle for AI supremacy is not just about business, it's about geopolitics. AI has the potential to redefine everything from warfare to economics to global governance. Whoever leads in AI will have an enormous advantage in shaping the future of industries like healthcare, finance, manufacturing, and even military defense. And for China, this technological race has become as much about national security as it is about economic power. The U.S. sees China's rapid rise in AI as a direct challenge to its global leadership. To further protect its technological edge, the U.S. has increasingly focused on decoupling from China, particularly in high-tech industries. This strategy aims to reduce U.S. dependence on Chinese supply chains and, in some cases, deny China access to crucial components like semiconductor chips. In turn, China has ramped up its efforts to secure its own semiconductor production capabilities, which have been heavily reliant on U.S. technology. In the long term, both nations are working toward building self-sustaining, independent tech ecosystems. The decoupling of U.S. and Chinese technology sectors has led to the creation of two separate tech ecosystems, one driven by American companies like Apple, Google, and Intel, and the other by Chinese giants like Huawei, Tencent, and Baidu. This split is likely to intensify in the coming years, as both nations work to safeguard their technological advantages and limit the other's access to critical components. In this high-stakes race for technological supremacy, the outcome will have profound implications not just for the U.S. and China but for the entire world. Will China emerge as the global leader in 5G, AI, and other emerging technologies, or will the U.S. succeed in maintaining its technological dominance? As the trade war continues, the world's two largest economies are set to clash over the future of innovation, power, and global influence. As the trade war between the U.S. and China unfolded, the ripples of its impact reached far beyond the borders of these two superpowers. The U.S. and China are the world's two largest economies, so when their trade relationship begins to falter, it creates a chain reaction that affects countries and industries around the globe. This is where the global economy truly begins to feel the heat. The interconnectedness of the global marketplace means that what happens in the U.S. and China doesn't just affect their economies, it can send shockwaves across entire industries and continents. One of the most significant impacts has been on global supply chains. China, as the world's manufacturing hub, has long been a crucial part of the production process for countless goods. From electronics to apparel, many companies in developed countries, including the U.S., rely on Chinese factories for low-cost manufacturing. However, with the imposition of tariffs and trade restrictions, this dynamic began to change. Costs for manufacturers increased, and production schedules were disrupted, leaving businesses scrambling to adjust. China's role as the factory of the world meant that any disruption to its manufacturing output would have a ripple effect on global industries. For example, U.S. companies that were sourcing components from China saw costs rise as tariffs were applied to Chinese-made products. Some companies, particularly in tech and electronics, were forced to move production to other countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. While this shift offered short-term relief, it came with its own set of challenges. New supply chains had to be established, and in many cases, labor costs were higher in these alternative locations. However, the problem wasn't just about shifting production. The entire global supply chain was facing delays. Ports around the world became congested with goods waiting to be shipped, and companies began to experience shortages of key components, particularly in the tech industry. This was particularly visible in the semiconductor sector, where companies like TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea, crucial suppliers to both the US and China, faced production bottlenecks. These delays had a domino effect, impacting industries like automotive, consumer electronics, and even medical devices. The trade war also brought into sharp focus the vulnerabilities of relying on a single country for critical goods and services. Countries began to reassess their reliance on China for manufacturing and raw materials, and this led to an increased focus on diversifying supply chains. The push for reshoring, the process of moving manufacturing back to domestic markets, gained momentum in several developed economies, particularly in the US and Europe. But the consequences of the trade war weren't limited to the US and China. The global economic impact was felt across emerging markets as well. Countries that heavily relied on trade with China, such as Brazil, Russia, and many in Africa, were hit hard by the slowdown in China's economy. These nations found themselves grappling with reduced demand for their exports, especially raw materials like oil, metals, and agricultural products. Many of these economies, which had grown dependent on Chinese investment and trade, faced significant economic setbacks. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, an ambitious project designed to build infrastructure and increase trade links between China and many countries across Asia, Africa, and Europe, faced challenges as well. The trade war and the resulting economic slowdown led to delays in infrastructure projects, reduced investments, and heightened uncertainty in many of the countries involved. While China had hoped that the BRI would solidify its economic influence, the disruptions caused by the trade war forced many of its partner nations to reconsider their reliance on Chinese capital and investment. In the short term, the effects of the trade war were clear: global growth slowed, and economic uncertainty loomed large. However, the long-term implications were even more significant. As the trade war between the US and China intensified, it became evident that the global economy was no longer going to function as it had in the past. The world was entering an era of deglobalization, where countries were rethinking their trade relationships, protecting their own industries, and reconsidering the level of economic dependence they had on China. The global economy was evolving, and the US-China trade war was one of the key drivers of this change. The shifting dynamics of global trade also led to a rise in economic nationalism. Governments around the world, particularly in the US and Europe, began to prioritize their own industries, protect their workers, and enact policies that favored local production over global sourcing. This America First or Europe First mentality created a wave of protectionist measures, as nations looked inward to shield their economies from the uncertainty of international markets. But while these moves to protect domestic industries may have seemed like a short-term solution, they come with long-term consequences. The global economy is intricately connected, and when one link in the chain is disrupted, it affects everyone. While the US and China have fought to assert their economic dominance, the real challenge will be managing the economic fallout and navigating a future where countries must balance national interests with the realities of a globalized world. The question now is, will we return to a world where open markets and free trade dominate, or will the rise of protectionism and economic rivalry lead to a more fragmented and volatile global economy? As we've seen, the US-China trade war is about more than just tariffs, it's about a fundamental shift in global power, economics, and technology. The choices made in Washington and Beijing will shape the future of global trade, international relations, and the very structure of our interconnected world. But the story doesn't end here. The next chapter of this trade war, and the ongoing rivalry between these two global superpowers, will continue to unfold, with both opportunities and challenges for the entire world. Will there be a new era of collaboration, or will we see more fragmentation and economic competition? One thing is certain, the outcome of this trade war will have lasting consequences for us all. Whether you're a business owner, a policymaker, or simply someone concerned about the future of global relations, it's crucial to stay informed and understand the forces that are reshaping the world economy. If you want to keep up with the latest developments on global trade, geopolitics, and the evolving US-China relationship, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates on this ongoing story. And feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think the future holds for the US-China trade war? Will it lead to more cooperation, or are we heading towards deeper economic divisions? We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join the conversation and stay informed about the latest global trends that will shape the future. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. As we move forward, the future of the US-China trade war seems uncertain, with both sides still entrenched in their positions. But beyond the immediate impact, the bigger question remains: what will the world look like once the dust settles? Will the global order that has existed for decades remain intact, or are we witnessing the beginning of a new era in global trade and international relations? The future of the US-China trade relationship will likely depend on how both nations adapt to a rapidly changing global landscape. On the one hand, China is determined to assert its place as a global superpower, not just economically, but also politically and technologically. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has shown its willingness to stand firm against US pressure, and as we've seen, it has successfully diversified its economic relationships and developed its own technological infrastructure. But on the other hand, the US faces significant challenges as it tries to maintain its dominant position in the global economy. The Trump administration's America First strategy, though effective in some areas, also revealed vulnerabilities in the US economy, vulnerabilities that are now being exposed in the form of inflation, supply chain disruptions, and economic slowdowns. The rise of economic nationalism, coupled with trade restrictions, has made the US more insular, but it's also made the global economy less predictable and less interconnected. The key to understanding where this conflict will go next is to recognize the long-term trends that are shaping both nations' strategies. For China, the focus is on self-sufficiency, building its own technological base, securing its supply chains, and ensuring it has less reliance on the West. With initiatives like Made in China 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative, China is positioning itself as a global leader in sectors like artificial intelligence, 5G, and green energy. For the US, the path forward is less clear. While the country is focused on reshoring and regaining control over critical industries, particularly in tech and manufacturing, it also faces increasing competition from countries that are no longer just passive participants in the global economy. Nations like India, Brazil, and even parts of Africa are now positioning themselves as alternatives to China for manufacturing and trade. The US must decide whether it will embrace a new wave of multilateralism, or whether it will continue to focus inward, attempting to rebuild its industries and job market from within. As the world shifts, so too does the geopolitical landscape. The US is no longer the sole superpower in the global arena. China is rapidly catching up, and other emerging economies are also asserting their influence. The European Union, Japan, and India are all vying for a larger role in shaping the global economy. The shift towards a more fragmented global economy means that we could see a world where global supply chains are shorter and less interconnected, with countries focusing more on regional trade and self-reliance. This would mean less efficiency in terms of cost and productivity but greater political control over critical industries. Countries may also prioritize national security and economic sovereignty, leading to a more divided world in terms of economic and technological blocs. Yet, there is hope for a different path. Despite the intensifying trade war and rising tensions, there is still potential for dialogue and cooperation. Both the US and China have significant incentives to prevent a full-scale decoupling. The global economy is too interconnected, and both countries stand to lose if they continue down a path of isolationism and protectionism. While the future remains uncertain, the potential for collaboration on global issues like climate change, public health, and sustainable development could provide a way to bridge the divides that have been deepened by the trade war.